I have spent the better part of my life listening to the dreams of the old. Not the dreams they had as children, nor the ambitions of their middle years, but the dreams that came to them after the body began to grow tired, after the great noise of ambition had quieted into something resembling silence. And in those dreams I noticed something the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. The old who remained luminous, the old whose eyes still carried fire, the old who seemed somehow younger than the young, they all shared certain habits, small habits, almost invisible habits, habits so quiet that one could pass through an entire lifetime without ever noticing their power. I want to speak to you tonight about 5 of these habits, not as a physician giving instructions, but as one traveler describing to another what he has seen on the long road, for the question of how to grow old, without dying inside. The question of how to carry the weight of years without becoming bitter. The question of how to keep the soul young while the body slowly returns to the earth. This is perhaps the most ancient question humanity has ever asked. The alchemists asked it. The mystics of every tradition asked it. And every grandmother who ever lit a candle in a quiet kitchen asked it, in her own wordless way. The figure that haunts most aging people is not death itself. It is something far stranger. It is the slow forgetting of who they once were, the gradual disappearance of meaning, the quiet suspicion that life has somehow passed them by while they were busy preparing for it. I have sat with men of 70 who wept not for what they had lost, but for what they had never lived. And I have sat with women of 85 who laughed like girls, because they had discovered something the world cannot teach. The difference between them was not luck, nor health, nor wealth. The difference lay in certain habits so simple that the modern mind, addicted to complexity, refuses to take them seriously. But the most surprising part is yet to come. For these habits are not techniques. They are not exercises. They are not items on a checklist that one performs in order to extract a desired result from life. No, they are something far older and far deeper. They are gestures of the soul. They are the small daily rituals through which a human being remains in conversation with the mystery of being alive. And the old who practiced them, even without knowing what they were doing, discovered the philosopher's stone the alchemists had searched for in vain. They discovered the secret of inner gold. Let me begin with the first habit. It is the habit of speaking to oneself as one would speak to an old friend. Not in vanity, not in narcissism, not in the modern manner of self-praise that has spread like an illness through our culture. No, I mean something altogether different. I mean the quiet daily practice of acknowledging one's own existence. The old who remained young were the ones who, upon waking, did not immediately flee into the noise of the day. They lingered for a moment in the threshold between sleep and waking. They listened. They asked themselves in some inner voice how they were. They greeted themselves the way one greets a beloved companion who has been with them through every joy and every sorrow. You may smile at this. You may think it is too small a thing to matter. But I have watched what happens to those who never perform this small ritual. They become strangers to themselves. They grow old in the company of someone they no longer recognize. The face in the mirror becomes an enemy. The body becomes a betrayer. And the soul, that ancient guest who has lived inside them for 70 or 80 years, departs unnoticed, unmourned, unthanked. The first habit then is the habit of inner companionship. It is the refusal to abandon oneself. What Jung said about this is deeply unsettling, and I will say it now in my own words. The relationship a person has with himself is the prototype of every other relationship he will ever have. If you cannot speak gently to your own inner being, you cannot truly speak gently to anyone else. If you cannot forgive yourself, you cannot truly forgive another. And the old who remained warm, the old who remained capable of love into their final years, they were the ones who had made peace with the long figure of themselves, the one that stretched backward through time, carrying every age they had ever been. They had befriended the child they once were. They had embraced the wounded adolescent. They had forgiven the striving adult. They had become, in some quiet way, complete. I remember a woman of nearly 90 who once told me something I have never forgotten. She said that every morning before she opened her eyes, she said 3 words to herself, "Here we are," not "here I am," but "here we are," for she had come to understand that she was not a single self. She was a small village of selves, gathered together inside a single body. The girl she had been, the bride, the mother, the widow, the grandmother, all of them still lived inside her, and every morning she greeted them all. In this small gesture, she practiced what the ancient mystics knew, the integration of the soul. This brings me to the second habit, and here we must descend a little deeper. The second habit is the habit of staying in conversation with the body, not as a master commands a servant, not as a young athlete commands his muscles, but as one would converse with a faithful old horse who has carried one through many countries. The old who remained young were the ones who had learned to listen to their bodies without panic. They felt a morning stiffness and did not interpret it as catastrophe. They noticed the slowing of their movements and did not despair. They received each new ache as a kind of message, sometimes a warning, sometimes simply a comment, sometimes a reminder of mortality that they could meet with a small, sad smile. The modern world has taught us to wage war on the aging body. The advertisements scream at us to fight, to resist, to deny, to erase the marks of time. And in this war, we lose something far more important than youth. We lose our relationship with the only home we will ever truly inhabit. The body is not the enemy of the soul. The body is the soul's most ancient companion. They have walked together through every moment of your life. And the habit of speaking gently to one's own body, of thanking it, of moving it kindly through the day. This is one of the great secrets of those who grow old in beauty. I've seen men in their 70s move through the world with the grace of dancers, not because their bodies were powerful, but because they had stopped fighting them. They walked slowly when slowness was called for. They sat in the sun without apology. They allowed themselves the long pleasure of a single cup of tea, drunk without hurry. And in this unhurried relationship with their own flesh, they discovered that the body in old age is not a ruin. It is a temple weathered by the seasons. And a temple weathered by the seasons is more sacred than a temple newly built. The detail most people overlook hides precisely here. The body in its later years becomes, in some mysterious way, more honest than the body in its youth. It cannot pretend any longer. It tells the truth about everything, about how you have lived, about what you have suppressed, about what you have refused to feel. The old who became young again were the ones who listened to this honesty without fear. They allowed their bodies to weep when weeping was needed. They allowed their bodies to rest when rest was needed. They allowed their bodies to laugh until they shook, because laughter, in the end, is the great medicine of the soul. The body, when treated as a wise old friend, returns his kindness 100-fold. It becomes the doorway through which meaning re-enters the life of the aging person. And here we arrive at the third habit, which is perhaps the most overlooked of all. It is a habit of staying connected to the symbolic life. I must explain what I mean by this, for the modern world has nearly lost the meaning of the word. The symbolic life is the life lived in relationship with images, with stories, with the deep patterns that have shaped the human soul for millennia. It is the life of dreams, of myths, of rituals, of small daily ceremonies. It is a recognition that we do not live by bread alone, but by meaning, and that meaning is not manufactured by the rational mind, but received from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere closer to the source of life itself. The old, who remained young, were the ones who had not abandoned the symbolic life. They had their small rituals. They lit candles on certain days. They visited certain places at certain seasons. They kept old photographs in particular drawers. They told the same stories, year after year, not because they had forgotten that they had told them before, but because the telling was a kind of prayer. They watched the changing of the light in autumn and felt that something in themselves was changing with it. They noticed the first snow. They noticed the first crocus pushing through the cold earth. They lived in conversation with the great rhythms of the world. And through this conversation, they remained part of something larger than their individual lives. Here begins the darkest game of the unconscious. When a human being severs the symbolic life, when they live only in the world of facts and numbers and productivity, the soul does not vanish. It goes underground, it becomes restless. It begins to send messages from the depths, and these messages take the form of anxiety, depression, sudden bursts of inexplicable grief, the strange sense that nothing matters. The old who fell into this state were the ones who had stopped honoring the symbolic. They had stopped reading old books, they had stopped looking at the moon. They had reduced their lives to errands and the small mechanical motions of survival, and the soul, neglected for too long, began to wither inside them. But those who kept the symbolic life alive, even in small, almost invisible ways, they remained luminous. I knew a man of 83 who every evening before going to bed would step outside for exactly 3 minutes and look at the sky. 3 minutes, that was his entire ritual. He did not pray in any traditional sense. He did not meditate. He simply stood there, looking up, allowing himself to feel small beneath the vastness. And he told me, with eyes that still carried the light of his youth, that those 3 minutes were the most important minutes of his day. For in those minutes, he remembered that he was a guest in something far larger than himself. He remembered that his small life was held within an immense mystery. And this remembering, this nightly return to the symbolic, kept his soul young while his body grew old. What mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries is that the human being is never merely a biological creature. We are also mythical creatures. We are creatures of meaning. We are characters in a story we did not write and cannot fully read. The old who remained vital were the ones who knew themselves to be characters in this larger story. They felt the presence of the ancestors. They felt the presence of those yet to come. They felt themselves to be a small but necessary thread in an ancient weaving. And this feeling, call it religious, call it poetic, call it whatever you wish, this feeling was the secret fuel of their long aliveness. I have come now to the fourth habit, and this one will surprise you. The fourth habit is the habit of cultivating a relationship with one's own shadow. Yes, even in old age. Perhaps especially in old age, for the shadow does not disappear with the passing of the years. On the contrary, the shadow, which is the sum of everything one has refused to acknowledge in oneself, becomes more visible as the ego loosens its grip. The old who remained young were the ones who had the courage to meet themselves at last. Not the polished self they had presented to the world, but the full self with all its contradictions, its hidden angers, its unspoken longings, its forgotten dreams. You see, there is a great temptation in old age to retreat into a comfortable mythology of oneself, to say, I was a good father, I was a hard worker, I did what I had to do, and to never look beneath these statements, never ask what was sacrificed, what was hidden, what was never lived. The old who fell into this temptation became brittle and defensive. They became the bitter old men and women that everyone knows and quietly avoids. They had stopped growing. They had sealed themselves inside a story that no longer breathed. But those who continued the inner work, those who allowed themselves, even at 80, to discover new things about who they had been and who they still were, they remained alive in the deepest sense. I have seen elderly people make discoveries about themselves at 75 that would have changed the course of their lives had they made them at 30. And yet, even at 75, these discoveries brought a strange and beautiful freedom. The old man who finally allowed himself to admit that he had wanted to be a painter and had become an accountant instead, he did not weep over the lost life. He took up his brushes and began to paint, with hands that trembled but with a heart that was finally honest. And in this small act, he integrated something that had been waiting inside him for 50 years. The real turning point begins right here. The shadow is not your enemy. The shadow is your unlived life waiting patiently in the darkness for you to return to it. The old who befriended their shadows in the final chapters of their lives often experienced what I can only call a second youth. Not a youth of the body that is gone and cannot be reclaimed, but a youth of the soul, a renewed curiosity, a renewed appetite for being alive, a willingness to be surprised by themselves. And this second youth, I have observed, is more beautiful than the first, because it is a youth that has been earned through suffering, through honesty, through the long descent into one's own depths. There is a paradox here that I must name. The young fear death because they fear losing the life they have. The old fear death for a different reason. They fear losing the life they never had. They fear leaving the world before they have truly lived in it. And the only cure for this fear is to live, finally, the parts of oneself that have been hidden for too long. To say the words that were never said. To love the way one always wanted to love. The shadow, when met with courage, becomes the doorway to the life one was meant to live. And now we come to the fifth habit, which is in some ways the deepest of them all. It is the habit of staying in service to something larger than oneself. I do not mean grand causes. I do not mean public works. I mean something far more intimate and far more sustaining. I mean the daily habit of caring for something or someone outside the small fortress of the ego. A garden, a grandchild, a neighbor, a cat, a correspondence with an old friend, a craft passed down to a younger hand, a small task done for the community. Anything at all that connects the aging person to the great river of life beyond their own private concerns. I have watched what happens when this fifth habit is absent. The old person, no matter how comfortable, begins to shrink. The walls of their world come closer and closer. Their concerns become smaller and smaller. They worry about the temperature of the room. They worry about minor symptoms. Not because these things truly matter, but because the soul, deprived of larger meaning, contracts into ever smaller circles. Eventually, the world of such a person becomes no larger than their own anxieties, until at last they are imprisoned in a cell of their own making. But the old who served, even in the smallest ways, they remained vast. I knew a woman of 92 who could no longer leave her apartment, who could barely see, whose hands had grown too weak to hold a book. And yet every day she telephoned 3 people. 3 people who were lonelier than she was. 3 people who needed to hear a human voice. That was her service. That was her connection to the great river. And she was, until the very last week of her life, one of the most alive human beings I have ever known. Her body had nearly disappeared, but her presence had grown enormous. She had become, through her small daily acts of care, something almost luminous. This is the great secret the modern world has forgotten. We have been taught that life is about accumulation, accumulating experiences, possessions, achievements. And so we approach old age as a slow theft, in which everything we have gathered is gradually taken from us. But the deeper truth is that life is not about accumulation at all. Life is about participation. And participation can continue in some form until the very last breath. The old who knew this, who continued to give, to care, even in the tiniest ways, they were the ones who remained eternally young. I want now to draw these 5 habits together, for they are not separate. They are 5 facets of a single jewel. The habit of inner companionship, the habit of conversation with the body, the habit of the symbolic life, the habit of meeting one's shadow, the habit of service. Together they form a kind of inner architecture. They construct, within the aging human being, a temple in which the soul can continue to live and grow long after the body has begun its slow return to the earth. And this temple, once built, cannot be destroyed by time. It cannot be destroyed by illness. It cannot be destroyed by loss. It can only be destroyed by neglect, by the failure to enter, by the refusal to inhabit one's own inner life. What mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries is that the great heroes did not become great by avoiding the descent. They became great by going into the underworld, meeting the shadow, befriending the strange figures of the depths, and returning with a gift for their people. And old age, properly lived, is the final and greatest descent. It is the alchemical work in which the lead of one's accumulated wounds is transformed, slowly and patiently, into the gold of wisdom. The old who completed this work, even partially, even imperfectly, became the wise elders that every culture once revered. I think often about what we have lost in our modern obsession with youth. We have lost the figure of the wise elder. We have lost the grandmother whose presence steadied the household. We have lost the grandfather whose silence carried more weight than 100 speeches. And in pushing the old to the margins, we have impoverished not only them, but ourselves. For when a culture loses its elders, it loses its memory, its depth, the long view that only those who have lived a long life can provide. But the old themselves can refuse to participate in this exile. They can become wise elders, not because the world calls them so, but because they have done the inner work that earns the title. And this is what these 5 habits make possible. They are the disciplines by which a human being ripens into the fullness of themselves before the final transition. Like a fruit that has hung long on the tree and gathered into itself all the warmth of many summers. There is a question I would like to leave with you tonight. And it is not a question I can answer for you. The question is this: which of these 5 habits is missing in your own life? Not in the life of some imagined old person you may someday become, but in your life now today. For these habits are not reserved for the old. They are the habits that make old age beautiful when it arrives, but they must be cultivated long before that. The young who begin to practice them now will become the luminous elders of tomorrow. The middle-aged who begin to practice them now will discover that the second half of life can be far richer than the first. And the old who begin to practice them now, even at the very end, will find that it is never too late. The soul does not measure time the way the body does. The soul can be born again in a single afternoon if the conditions are right. The figure that haunts you in your dreams was always yourself. The wise old man, the wise old woman, the figure of luminous age that appears in the mythology of every culture, this figure is not someone else. This figure is you, waiting at the end of your own road, waiting for you to become who you have always been, waiting for you to ripen into the fullness that has been your destiny from the beginning. The 5 habits I have described are not techniques for postponing death. They are techniques for arriving at the end of life as the person you are always meant to be. And so I leave you tonight with this: find the small habits, begin the small practices, greet yourself in the morning, speak gently to your body, honor the symbolic, meet your shadow, serve something larger than yourself. Do these things not because they will make you live longer, though they may, but because they will make your life, however long it lasts, into something worthy of having been lived. The old who remained young did not discover the fountain of youth. They discovered something far better. They discovered the fountain of meaning. And from that fountain, they drank every day, in small sips, until the very end. When was the last time you sat with yourself in silence and asked what your soul truly needed? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be surprised by your own depths? When was the last time you stepped outside, looked up at the night sky, and remembered that you are part of something immeasurably old and immeasurably vast? Perhaps tonight is such a night. Perhaps the small habit begins now, in this moment, in the quiet that follows these words. The journey into the depths begins always with a single step, and that step is taken not in some distant future, but here in the only moment that has ever been truly yours.